Welcome, everyone. Today, we're stepping back in time to explore the complex, often hidden lives within the grand mansions and vast fields of the antebellum South. Southern plantations were not just symbols of wealth and power, they were living theaters of control, oppression, and deeply embedded social norms. Behind the gleaming facades of plantation homes, where white families lived in opulence, and in the surrounding quarters where enslaved people toiled, lay stories of tension, transgression, and pain. This documentary isn't just about the lavish balls and opulent lifestyles of Southern aristocracy, nor is it solely focused on the brutal realities of enslaved life. Today, we focus on the Southern mistresses, those seemingly genteel women who, for generations, were seen as paragons of virtue and refinement. Trapped in a world that granted them status but denied them freedom, many mistresses lived deeply lonely lives. Some found solace in unexpected, forbidden places, often in relationships with the very people their husbands claimed ownership over. What did it mean for a white woman to cross the lines of race and status to form a bond with an enslaved man? What were the stakes for both parties in a world where such interactions were not just taboo, but illegal? Our story today centers on one such relationship that took place on a fictional Southern plantation, the Devereaux estate, a story that ultimately ended in tragedy for everyone involved. So, settle in as we uncover the hidden truths, the dangers, and the desperate emotions that defined this dark chapter of Southern history. The Devereaux plantation, a sprawling estate set amidst the fertile lands of Georgia, was a place where wealth and brutality coexisted. Jonathan Devereaux, the master of the estate, was a man known for his rigid control over his property and the people who lived there. To the outside world, he was the very picture of a successful planter, a man of influence and authority, commanding respect among his peers. But behind the gates of the Devereaux estate, Jonathan's iron rule was absolute and merciless. The mansion itself was a testament to this power, a grandiose building with towering white columns, lush gardens, and a sweeping view of the fields beyond, where cotton stretched as far as the eye could see. But its beauty hid a darker truth. The opulence of the estate was built on the backs of hundreds of enslaved people, whose labor generated immense wealth for their owners. Jonathan's wife, Charlotte Devereaux, was supposed to be the crown jewel of this empire. Beautiful, poised, and educated in Savannah's finest schools, she was the perfect Southern belle, a picture of grace and refinement. But Charlotte's life was far from the genteel ideal she had been raised to embody. For Charlotte, marriage to Jonathan was not the fairy tale she had once imagined. Instead, it was a gilded cage. Like many women of her class, she had been groomed to be a loyal wife and a diligent mistress of the household, managing the day-to-day affairs of the estate while her husband oversaw the business of cotton and trade. Yet Charlotte was isolated and deeply unhappy. Jonathan was a distant, often cruel man, who saw her more as a trophy than a partner. He was frequently away on business, leaving Charlotte alone to navigate the suffocating monotony of plantation life. It was in this atmosphere of loneliness and confinement that Charlotte's gaze fell upon Elijah, a man unlike any she had known before. Elijah was no ordinary enslaved worker. As the plantation's blacksmith, he held a unique position within the rigid social order of the estate. His role required a high degree of skill and autonomy, setting him apart from the field hands whose lives were marked by relentless, grueling labor. Elijah's status as a blacksmith granted him a small but significant degree of respect, even among the white overseers. He moved with confidence, his powerful frame and calm demeanor a stark contrast to the hunched, beaten bodies of those who toiled under the overseer's whip. For Charlotte, Elijah represented something entirely different, a man who, despite his bondage, seemed unbroken. Their first meeting was almost accidental. Charlotte had ventured out one humid afternoon, feeling suffocated by the stifling silence of the mansion. She found herself near the smithy, a place she rarely visited, drawn by the rhythmic clanging of metal on metal. It was a sound that spoke of strength and creation, a far cry from the lifeless parlors and empty drawing rooms of her home. Standing in the doorway, she watched as Elijah worked, his brow furrowed in concentration. His hands, strong and deft, shaped the iron with a precision that fascinated her. When he looked up and saw her standing there, his surprise was evident. Quickly, he straightened, his expression guarded. "Mistress," he murmured, bowing his head slightly in deference. Charlotte felt a strange flutter in her chest. I didn't mean to interrupt," she stammered, glancing around at the tools and half-finished projects. "I was just curious." Elijah said nothing, merely nodded. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the tension between them thick and almost palpable. Then, without another word, Charlotte turned and walked away, her heart pounding in her chest. That first, brief encounter could have ended there. But something had shifted. Over the following weeks, Charlotte found herself returning to the smithy again and again, each time lingering a little longer, speaking a little more. Elijah, at first wary and suspicious, gradually began to open up. Their conversations remained guarded, careful, as both were acutely aware of the danger in their growing familiarity. But slowly, something began to change. What drew Charlotte to Elijah was not just his physical strength or skill, but his quiet resilience, his ability to remain himself even in a world designed to strip him of his humanity. In him, she saw a strength of character that was utterly lacking in the men of her own class, men like her husband, who ruled through fear and brutality. For Elijah, the attention of the mistress was a source of deep unease. He understood the stakes all too well. Any perceived intimacy between a white mistress and an enslaved man was not just scandalous, it was deadly. If Jonathan or the overseer caught even a hint of impropriety, the consequences would be swift and brutal. But despite his misgivings, Elijah found himself drawn to Charlotte's intelligence, her yearning for something beyond the suffocating roles they were both trapped in. Their relationship developed slowly, in stolen moments and hushed conversations. Charlotte would bring small items for Elijah to repair, a broken clasp, a damaged locket, anything to have an excuse to visit the smithy. And Elijah, against his better judgment, began to look forward to these visits. He began to see not just the mistress, but the woman beneath, lonely, intelligent, and desperately seeking a connection. For both of them, these meetings were a refuge, a brief escape from the rigid structures that defined their lives. But they were also playing with fire. Plantation life was a network of eyes and ears, and secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. It wasn't long before the other enslaved people began to notice the mistress's frequent visits to the smithy. Whispers spread through the quarters, soft and fearful. People spoke of danger, of the terrible consequences that would follow if the master learned of what was happening. Those whispers eventually reached Rebecca Hartwell, a neighbor and friend of the Devereaux family. A sharp-tongued, observant woman, Rebecca had always been envious of Charlotte's beauty and status. Sensing an opportunity, she began to stoke the flames of gossip, ensuring that Jonathan himself would hear of his wife's indiscretions. When Jonathan finally confronted Charlotte, his fury was terrifying. "You've disgraced me," he snarled, his face twisted in rage. "Humiliated me in my own home." Charlotte, pale and trembling, tried to deny it, but Jonathan would hear none of it. "I'll not be made a fool of by some slave," he spat. "You think you can defy me and get away with it?" The punishment was swift and brutal. That night, Elijah was dragged from his quarters, beaten and chained. "You're being sold," Jonathan growled, his voice filled with cold hatred. "Tomorrow, at first light." When Charlotte learned of what had happened, she was devastated. She tried to plead with Jonathan, to beg for Elijah's life, but her husband's heart was stone. "You'll learn your place, Charlotte," he hissed. "And he'll be gone. Forever." The next morning, Elijah was taken away in chains, his expression stoic, his eyes filled with unspoken sorrow. For Charlotte, his departure was the final blow. The mansion that had once felt merely oppressive now felt like a prison. The emptiness of the grand estate became suffocating, its grandeur mocking her pain. Each room, each hallway echoed with memories of their brief, stolen moments together, moments that now felt like they belonged to a dream, quickly fading in the harsh light of reality. In the days following Elijah's forced departure, Charlotte's despair deepened. She drifted through the mansion like a ghost, her presence almost invisible to the staff and slaves who served her. Her once vibrant spirit, already weakened by years of neglect and isolation, seemed to wither entirely. The spark of defiance, the brief glimpse of passion that Elijah had kindled, was now replaced by a hollow, aching emptiness. Jonathan, triumphant in his punishment, grew even more distant, avoiding her gaze as if the sight of her was an affront to his pride. As the weeks turned into months, the reality of Elijah's absence settled heavily over the plantation. The smithy, once filled with the sounds of hammering metal and the rhythmic clang of Elijah's work, now stood silent and empty. The tools, once cared for meticulously, began to rust. The new blacksmith, a sullen, inexperienced man, could not match Elijah's skill or artistry. Even Jonathan, despite his rage, could not ignore the impact of Elijah's loss on the estate's operations. The plantation's productivity faltered, and small but noticeable problems began to accumulate. But the practical losses were nothing compared to the emotional devastation Charlotte endured. Forbidden to speak of Elijah or even acknowledge what had happened, she was trapped in a suffocating silence. Every trace of Elijah's existence was systematically erased from the estate, his belongings, the tools he had crafted, even the small tokens Charlotte had once brought him. Yet, try as Jonathan might to erase the past, Elijah's absence lingered like a wound that refused to heal. Charlotte's grief, though unspoken, was palpable, hanging over the household like a shroud. In time, the isolation took its toll on Charlotte's health. She grew thin and pale, her once lively eyes dull and empty. The other plantation mistresses, who had once envied her beauty and status, began to whisper among themselves. "She's wasting away," they murmured at gatherings and afternoon teas. Consumed by some hidden grief. But none dared to ask her directly, and none suspected the true reason for her decline. To them, she was simply another fragile southern woman, a victim of delicate nerves and a weak constitution, nothing more. Jonathan, for his part, refused to acknowledge the depth of his wife's suffering. To him, Elijah was a nuisance that had been dealt with, a mistake corrected. But as Charlotte's condition worsened, even he could not remain entirely indifferent. In a misguided attempt to restore her spirits, he suggested a trip, an extended stay in Savannah or Charleston, away from the stifling atmosphere of the plantation. But Charlotte refused. Leaving the plantation, the place that held her last memories of Elijah, felt like a betrayal. If she left, it would be as if he had never existed at all. Desperate and alone, Charlotte began to retreat further into herself. She would spend hours wandering the grounds, lingering near the smithy where Elijah had once worked, as if hoping to catch a glimpse of him, or hear the faint echo of his voice. The estate's slaves, though wary and fearful, watched her with a kind of quiet sympathy. They, more than anyone, understood the nature of loss and separation, though they could never voice it. Some of the older women, filled with a mix of pity and bitterness, whispered among themselves that Charlotte's suffering was a kind of punishment, a small taste of the pain and powerlessness that enslaved women had endured for generations. But there was no solace for Charlotte, no closure. Even as the seasons changed and life on the estate moved on, she remained trapped in the past. Her obsession with Elijah became her only comfort, the one thread that kept her from slipping entirely into madness. She began to secretly collect small objects that reminded her of him, a piece of iron left forgotten in the smithy, a handkerchief he had once used. These items, hidden away in a small, locked chest, became her only connection to the man she had lost. Meanwhile, Elijah's fate remained unknown. Sold to a distant plantation, he became just another nameless body among the thousands who toiled under the sun. But for Charlotte, his memory loomed larger than ever. She began to imagine what might have been if things had been different, if he had been free, if she had been born into a different life. In her mind, she constructed elaborate fantasies of escape, of running away to some distant place where the rules of race and class held no power. But these dreams were just that, dreams, fragile and fleeting, dissipating in the cold light of dawn. With every passing day, the world around Charlotte grew smaller, darker. The once grand estate, with its sweeping fields and stately mansion, became a prison of her own making. The other mistresses and neighbors began to avoid her, their gossip turning from pity to disdain. "She's lost her mind," they whispered. Driven mad by her own guilt. Yet, none understood the true nature of her torment. To them, she was a fallen woman, a cautionary tale of what happened when a lady forgot her place. In the end, Charlotte became a ghost haunting the very mansion that had once been her domain. Her story, like so many others, faded into obscurity, a secret hidden behind layers of silence and shame. For generations, the Devereux plantation continued to prosper, its history scrubbed clean of any hint of scandal. But the memory of what happened lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it, passed down in hushed whispers among the enslaved people who survived. And so, the tale of Charlotte and Elijah became one more tragic chapter in the dark, tangled history of the South, a reminder of the cruelty, the forbidden desires, and the dangerous defiance that simmered beneath the surface of plantation life. It is a story that speaks to the enduring human need for connection, even in the face of overwhelming power and prejudice. And it serves as a stark reminder of the cost of crossing boundaries in a world built on division and control.